Well, it's such a delight and an honor to be here. My wife and I live in the largest Krishna community in North America, in northern Florida, Alachua, Florida, near Gainesville. So many devotees and programs and hundreds of things going on. But I prefer the family like love here in Tucson at the Tucson Temple. So, my wife permitting, I try to come here as often as possible. I'm here for 3 weeks, and she said, 3 weeks? But she allowed, so appreciate that.
Why not 4 weeks?
Why not 4 weeks? Yeah. So, the title of tonight's talk is The Three Great Incentives, or What Floats My Boat in 2025. I've intentionally made tonight's talk short. It's just about 17 minutes. That'll give us time to stretch, maybe ask questions, and so forth. So I wanted to start with a question. Think about this. What's one of the biggest differences between animal life and human life? Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that animals have very few choices. Their limited brain power restricts their activities to the most basic functions. They're focused mainly on surviving, so their choices are limited. That's not what you would call a glamorous life. But in the human form, particularly in today's relatively wealthy and mobile society, we enjoy practically unlimited choices. For example, we can choose which career we'll pursue, whom we'll partner with, who our friends will be, how we'll dress, whom we'll vote for, where we'll live, what we'll eat, where we will travel, what kind of car we'll drive. Our choices are practically infinite. But what if I told you that our seemingly infinite choices, when you boil them down, really translate into three great incentives? So for our purposes tonight, rather than focusing on the choices available to us, we'll focus on what incentivizes us to make those choices. Now, by way of background, the science of Krishna consciousness is actually the highest, most complex science in existence. Now, I say that because it deals with the subtleties of the most subtle element, namely consciousness. It teaches us how to master our consciousness and harmonize it with superconsciousness. At the same time, this very complex science of Krishna consciousness allows us to conceptualize things, to visualize things in very simple terms. And when you think about that, isn't that one feature of something that's truly great? It encompasses the most complex and yet can be expressed in the simplest terms. So if we view life in terms of its unlimited choices, the result is confusion. What if we could see life in simpler terms, so that rather than being bewildered by the infinite, we're supported by the meaningful finite? If you walk into a huge clothing store or mega grocery store, the unlimited varieties of goods are actually mesmerizing. And it's designed that way to put us in an altered state of consciousness so that discrimination goes out the window. If you've tried ChatGPT, the beauty of it is that it offers just one or two responses versus the 10 quadrillion choices from a Google search. If life can be viewed comprehensively, but simply, it's saner than being faced with millions of possibilities. So, as promised, here are the three great incentives. One, we try to derive sensual or mental pleasure out of something, whether a person, a place, a sense object, or even an idea. So that's incentive number one. We look around us and see what we can get out of the situation. What's in it for me? Now let's expand on that thought. Suppose you have unlimited facility to enjoy your senses. You're rich, you're charismatic, successful, bold, curious, powerful, beautiful, intelligent. In other words, if you want it, you can get it. And so you get more and more and more. Whatever you want, you get. But think about it. Does all this getting get you anywhere? Do you ever reach a point of satiation? Do you ever think enough is enough? I mean, our ability to enjoy food, for example, is limited. Our capacity for sex is limited. And accumulating more and more wealth, if our motive is simply to gloat over our riches, that's an empty path. In fact, by the estimation of some, the unrestricted accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few has dire consequences for society as a whole. Now, this is nothing new. There are wonderful accounts from the ancient historical texts of people gaining virtually unlimited wealth, power, and influence. But their greed knew no bounds because, as we know, greed, by its nature, knows no bounds. Their endless lusts to accumulate more and more ultimately led to their destruction. And if we're just a little bit thoughtful, we realize that material enjoyment and material suffering are two sides of the same coin. They're inseparable. Like the old saying from the gangster movies, if you can't do the time, then don't do the crime. If we can't tolerate the pain of time in this world, then don't seek the illusory pleasures dangling in front of our faces. Because every single pinch of material enjoyment has, as a consequence, material pain. Okay, so we'll call that first incentive, the incentive to enjoy this world, to splurge. Now, the second great incentive springs from frustration when we realize that seeking enjoyment in this world is a dead-end proposition. The second great incentive is to give up all hope of happiness in this world and try to become one with the everlasting light of the spiritual world. So the first great incentive is to splurge. So let's call the second great incentive, you can guess that, to merge. People who want to merge into God's holy aura are considered more elevated than the splurgers because at least they're attempting to get off the karmic wheel. But there's also an insidious side to merging. Can you guess what that is? The insidious side to merging is that we delude ourselves into thinking that we've become God. The splurgers try to play God by thinking themselves the Lord of all they survey. And the mergers not only play God, they convince themselves that they've become God. But that's a very dangerous proposition. Can you guess why? Because it's the height of self-delusion. So you may ask yourself, what's the value of understanding these incentives? Well, if we carefully observe ourselves, our thoughts, words, and actions, Well, notice that at absolutely every second of our lives, we're ruled by one of these great incentives to splurge or to merge. For example, if we're in pain and simply want to stop the pain at all costs, that's an example of merging. And in extreme cases, if the pain gets intolerable and I want to take my own life, in other words, end my existence, that's a more extreme example of merging. Now, the first two incentives, splurging and merging, have something in common. They're both of this material world, and they're both reactive. In the case of splurging, my mind and senses dictate, and I react. And in the case of merging, I react to the pain and frustration of material existence, so the only visible out is to merge, to deny my individuality and enter into God's great light. Now, you might be interested to know that merging forms the basis for virtually every great Eastern religious tradition: Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism. And splurging, but with self-control, is the basis for virtually every great Western religious tradition. But neither the Eastern nor the Western traditions provide us with a permanent solution to the dilemma of conditioned life. Splurging and merging are both reactive, and therefore they don't resolve what is really bugging us: the proverbial bee in our bonnet, the burr under our saddle, or as the English say, the twist in our knickers. So what is the third great incentive? What is the incentive that quickly and effectively places us on the path of everlasting freedom and joy? Well, my apologies, it doesn't exactly rhyme, but it's the best I could do. We have to splurge, then to merge, and finally to serve. But wait a minute, isn't serving rather mundane compared to merging? After all, to merge with Krishna's light is purely spiritual. But service sounds material, and by mundane logic, you have a point. Prabhupada, seated to my left, to your right, our founder, was once asked, "What is the purpose of life?" His response, "The purpose of life is to enjoy." Can anyone deny this? So let's look at splurging, merging, and serving in terms of the pleasure they afford. By our own life experience, splurging provides momentary pleasure with far more pain. Just look at our own bodies. There are a few pleasure centers, a few ways to derive fleeting happiness, but virtually unlimited ways to experience pain in our bodies. What about merging? Well, the wisdom texts tell us that in the grand scheme of things, merging is also temporary. It may last a long, long time by terrestrial years, but compared to the eternal nature of the soul, it's just a flash in the pan. Why? Because ultimately, as spirit beings, our happiness is found in relating to one another, loving one another, not just vibrating in the eternal light. So after a long, long time, we ultimately return to Earth to continue our journey. So even though the pleasure of merging is infinitely greater than splurging, it's still temporary. Finally, let's look at the pleasure potential of serving. But remember, for our purposes, serving refers only to service to Krishna and his devotees. If I'm serving my family, my community, my nation, or the entire world, I'm simply serving an extension of my false ego. So serving in this refers only to service to Krishna and his devotees. What's so special about serving versus splurging or merging? Well, it's the only process that connects us with Krishna in a selfless, unmotivated way. And it's that purity of service that touches Krishna, that truly moves him. By contrast, if we want to exploit Krishna's material energy, in other words, be little imitation Krishnas, or if we want to give up our individuality and become one with Krishna, why would that please him? Why would Krishna help the competition? So let's return to the topic of the pleasure available to those who serve Krishna. In the wisdom texts, Krishna is described as Akila Rasamrita Murti. He's the embodiment of all transcendental relationships and the reservoir of all pleasure. The oldest text in existence, the Brahma Samhita, states, quote, Krishna resides in his own realm, Goloka, with Radha and her expansions, who are permeated with blissful spiritual relationships. Krishna is surrounded by the embodiments of the highest spiritual joy. That same text, Brahma Samhita, further states, Krishna's transcendental form is full of truth, consciousness, and bliss, and he is radiant with spiritual effulgence. In other words, Krishna's form is made of spiritual bliss. The Bhagavad Purana, the book we study every morning, expresses the same thing but in a negative way. It says, those who give up the path of devotion to Krishna and instead seek happiness elsewhere are actually pursuing suffering. And another text that we study, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, expresses it like this. All glories to the chanting of the holy name of Krishna, which increases the ocean of transcendental bliss at every step and allows us to taste the full nectar for which we are always anxious. Now, when the curtains are open, you will see Radha, or Srimati Radharani. She's the young girl who always accompanies Krishna. Radharani is described as Krishna's Hladini Shakti, his pleasure potency. In fact, to worship Krishna directly is not the best way to please him. Rather, Krishna is pleased if we worship his pure devotees. And his most exalted devotee is Srimati Radharani. Another name for Radha is Hara, which in the form of address becomes Hare. And that's why we chant the Maha Mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Now, remember how I said earlier that our every thought, word, and deed is permeated either by a mood of splurging, merging, or serving. And that also applies to when we practice the religious process of the age, the chanting of Hare Krishna. If I chant Hare Krishna and want to gain something materially, or simply be liberated from material existence, that's chanting in the mood of splurging or merging. So, I have a suggestion. The next time you're chanting Hare Krishna, try the following. Become very quiet, look within honestly, and ask yourself, which of the great incentives to splurge, to merge, or to serve is driving my chanting? Now, don't judge, just notice. And that will help purify your chanting and help you come to the highest consciousness. And as we become purified from our unwanted habits, we gradually become fixed in devotional service. Then we get an actual taste for chanting Hare Krishna, which becomes a steady attachment to Krishna. Gradually, our spiritual emotions intensify, and finally, there's an awakening of prema, or pure love, the most sublime state of spiritual consciousness. Our Srila Prabhupada was once asked by a reporter, Swamiji, what's the result of all this chanting? And Prabhupada's response was, why, more chanting. As we become purified of our bad habits, we begin to experience the sublime pleasure that is the chanting of the holy names. We gradually attain our original spiritual nature and connect directly with Krishna, who is the reservoir of all love and all pleasure. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Hare Krishna. So if you have any questions, we have a few minutes. I'm fine either way. Yes, Miss Lalita.
I was wondering if you could tell us what would you say is your fondest memory in all of your Krishna consciousness?
So Lalita is asking, what is my fondest memory in all of my experience in our ISKCON movement? Well, I had a few brief but very intense exchanges with Srila Prabhupada. And several other devotees have described a similar experience. I happened to be alone, and Prabhupada was returning from a walk or an engagement at the then it was a little tiny temple outside of Paris. And I was alone in the little front yard as Prabhupada approached. So I saw him and I took advantage of the situation, and I really very enthusiastically threw myself at his feet and said the prayers of pranams in praise of him. And then when I looked up, he was maybe that far from my face. And and this is the experience that many others have described. He looked into my eyes. And in that moment, I got the sense that he knew everything about me, that there was nothing I could hide, and that I just felt fully spiritually naked in the presence of my spiritual master. It was a very, very deep connection. So one of his assistants, Shuta Kirti, wrote a book about his experiences with Prabhupada. And in his opinion, when Prabhupada had this deep eye-to-eye, face-to-face exchange with a disciple, he was deciding or asking Krishna or searching, how can I engage this person in Krishna service? So anyway, that was unforgettable. I mean, the Prabhupada's consciousness was just indescribably, inconceivably deep. I know, speaking for myself, I can't begin to comprehend the depth of his consciousness. And at the same time, and those who knew him very well, I didn't, but those who knew him very well described that he was very present. And at the same time, he seemed like he was off with Krishna somewhere. Very present, and yet in some sublime state, in some sublime location. So again, I had very few exchanges with him, but things that I personally will never forget. Thank you. Thank you for your question. Oh, Sureshwar, G.
Well, it just struck me, your answer to Lalita's question was kind of the sublime, what to say, you know how when people almost die, they say, my whole life passed before me. So, but when you looked at Prabhupada, it was like your whole future was opening up just by that glance. How can I engage this? It's just the opposite. It's the sublime alternative.
Yeah.
Near death is one, and then eternal life.
Near eternal life. Yes, Sureshwar Prabhu, for those of you at home, making a very good point that often people say, or that when they're about to die, their life passes before them. But this is the opposite example, that by Prabhupada having this wonderful exchange, it's like my future, at least in his eyes, passed before him. The future possibilities of devotional service, of purification, of all the steps that I mentioned toward the end of my little talk. Yeah, we're so fortunate to be either directly initiated disciples of his or grand disciples of his. There's a difference, but there's no difference, because his presence is so absolute. His teachings are absolute. And anyone can take full advantage of a relationship with Srila Prabhupada and feel that reciprocation, whether or not, some of the most wonderful, productive disciples in our movement were initiated by him, but rarely saw him. And Prabhupada comments that he had very few personal interactions with his spiritual master. So it's not based on physical presence. It's based on surrender and fully giving oneself to the teachings of the spiritual master. All right, we'll end there. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna. Thank you for being here.